music stopped the moment their hands touched. Alara Finch felt it before she understood it. A jolt that ran up her arm and settled deep in her chest, like a second heartbeat waking up inside her own. She had been dancing with a masked stranger for less than a minute, and already the world around her had gone quiet, as if every other sound had been swallowed by the sudden roar in her own blood. The stranger stiffened too. She felt his fingers tighten around hers, felt the way his breath caught. Around them, the ballroom of Ashgrove Hall spun with candlelight and silver masks, hundreds of guests laughing and turning under crystal chandeliers, none of them noticing that something enormous had just happened in the middle of the dance floor. Alara had not wanted to come to the masquerade at all. She was a healer's assistant, not a noble, and she had only gotten inside because her friend Wren had a spare invitation and a talent for sneaking people past palace guards. Alara had borrowed a green silk gown and a silver mask shaped like feathers, and she had told herself she would watch from the edges, admire the grand hall, and leave before anyone noticed she did not belong. Instead, a tall man in a black mask had asked her to dance, and she had said yes before she could think better of it. Now his gloved hand was pressed to hers, and something inside her chest was pulling toward him so strongly it frightened her. "You feel that?" he said. It was not a question. "I don't know what I feel," Alara whispered. He drew her closer, and for a moment the ballroom disappeared entirely. His eyes behind the mask were a deep amber, almost gold, and they were fixed on her, as if she were the only person in the world. Alara's wolf, usually a quiet, sleepy thing at the back of her mind, suddenly sat up and howled with a longing so sharp it stole her breath. "Who are you?" she asked. "Does it matter tonight?" he answered, and something in his voice made her forget to press for an answer. They moved to the edge of the dance floor without deciding to, drawn by an instinct neither of them could name, until they were standing beneath a stone archway that opened onto the palace gardens. Moonlight fell over rows of white roses. The music from the ballroom became a faint hum behind them. "I should not be here," Alara said, though she made no move to leave. "Neither should I," the stranger admitted, "but I cannot make myself walk away from you." Alara's heart pounded. She told herself this was the wine, or the magic of masks and moonlight, or simply the excitement of being somewhere she was never meant to be. But her wolf knew better. Her wolf recognized something in him that her mind refused to name, a pull as old as her kind, a thread tightening between two hearts that had never met before tonight. "Tell me your name," she said again, softer this time. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alara almost stepped back, but then his hand rose to gently touch her jaw, tilting her face up to his, and every thought of leaving vanished. "Later," he murmured. "Let this be simple, just for tonight." She should have insisted. She should have pulled away and gone back inside where it was safe and ordinary. Instead, she let him lower his mask, just enough to press his lips to hers, and the moment their mouths met, the pull inside her chest became something violent and unstoppable, like a dam breaking. He groaned against her lips, and his hand slid to the back of her neck, and, before either of them understood what was happening, his wolf surged forward beneath his skin, overtaking his careful control. Alara felt teeth graze the curve of her shoulder where her gown had slipped, felt a sharp, singular bite of pain that dissolved instantly into warmth, into belonging, into something that felt like coming home to a place she had never been. The stranger froze. Alara gasped, pressing a hand to her shoulder, feeling the mark already sealing itself beneath her palm, a symbol neither of them had chosen, burned there by instinct alone. "What did you do?" she breathed. The stranger stared at her, his amber eyes wide with shock, his own palm curling as if he too had felt something brand itself into his skin. "I didn't mean to," he said, voice rough. "I have never lost control like that. Never." Alara stumbled back a step, her mind racing. She knew what a mark meant among her kind. It was not something given lightly, not a mistake to laugh off in the morning. It was a bond, deep and permanent, tying two wolves together whether they wanted it or not. "Who are you?" she demanded, panic rising now, sharp and cold beneath the warmth still humming through her veins. He reached for her, and for a moment she saw something almost helpless in his expression, a man startled by his own actions. "Please," he said, "let me explain." But footsteps sounded from the archway behind him, palace guards moving through the garden on their rounds, and the fear of being caught overtook every other feeling in Alara's chest. She was a nobody in a borrowed dress at a royal masquerade, and she had just been marked by a stranger she did not know, in a place she was never supposed to be. She turned and ran. She heard him call after her, once, a single word that might have been her name if he had known it, but she did not stop. She gathered her skirts and moved through the garden hedges, past startled couples and drifting lanterns, until she reached a side gate Ren had shown her earlier, and slipped out into the dark streets beyond the palace walls. She ran until her lungs burned and the sounds of the masquerade faded completely behind her, until she reached the small healer's cottage on the edge of town where she lived and worked, and only then did she allow herself to stop, chest heaving, back pressed against the cool wooden door. Her shoulder throbbed, not with pain, but with something else, something warm and alive, as though a second pulse now beat beneath her skin in perfect rhythm, with a heart that was not her own. She peeled back the edge of her gown with shaking fingers, and found the mark glowing faintly in the darkness, a pattern of interlocking lines she had only ever seen in old healers' texts that spoke of alpha bonds and true mates and unbreakable ties between wolves. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "No, no, no." Because there was only one kind of wolf in the entire kingdom whose bite could brand a mark that glowed like starlight, and only one wolf who would have been standing in the royal gardens tonight, wearing a mask to hide from a ballroom full of people expecting him to choose a bride. The Alpha King himself. Alara sank to the floor of her small cottage, staring at the mark on her shoulder, and understood, with a terror that made her stomach twist, that whoever the masked stranger truly was, she was now bound to him in a way that could never be undone. Miles away, back inside the golden light of Ashgrove Hall, the man behind the mask stood frozen beneath the stone archway, staring at his own palm, where a matching mark had begun to burn itself into his skin, pulsing gently like a second heartbeat that refused to be ignored. He had come to the masquerade only because his council insisted he show his face to the visiting delegations, hoping he might finally choose a mate from among the noble houses gathered under his roof. He had never intended to dance with anyone. He had certainly never intended to kiss a stranger in the garden, let alone lose control so completely that his wolf took over before his mind could stop it. And yet here he was, marked, bound, and utterly unable to explain what had just happened. He did not even know her name. He only knew the taste of her lips, the sound of her voice, the way his wolf had gone calm and satisfied the instant his teeth met her skin, as if some deep, ancient part of him had finally found what it had been searching for his entire life. He pressed his palm flat against the cool stone of the archway, breathing hard, trying to steady himself, but his wolf would not settle. It paced beneath his skin, restless and hungry, already aching with the absence of a woman he had known for less than an hour. Somewhere in this kingdom, a girl in a green silk gown was running from him, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to follow. He did not follow, not yet. Guards were approaching from the garden path, and he was still wearing his mask, still hidden, still safe from the truth of what he had done. He forced himself to walk calmly back toward the ballroom, straightening his jacket, arranging his face into the composed mask his people expected of their king. Inside, the celebration continued exactly as it had before, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed. He found his most trusted friend, a broad-shouldered wolf named Edric Hale, standing near the refreshment table, watching the crowd with the bored patience of a man who had attended 100 such events. Edric took one look at his face and set down his glass. "What happened to you?" Edric asked quietly. The king said nothing at first. He simply held up his palm, where the faint glow of the mark still pulsed beneath his skin, and watched Edric's expression shift from confusion to disbelief. "You marked someone," Edric said, voice dropping even lower. "Tonight, here. I don't know who she is," the king admitted. "She was wearing a mask, green dress, silver feathers. She ran before I could stop her." Edric stared at him as though he had grown a second head. "You marked a stranger and let her run." "It happened before I understood what was happening," the king said, frustration edging into his voice. "My wolf has never done anything like this, not once, not with anyone." Edric glanced around the ballroom, lowering his voice further. "Do you understand what this means? You cannot simply unmark someone. If your council finds out you have bonded yourself to an unknown woman, someone who is not even present among the noble houses, they will see it as a disaster." "I am aware," the king said tightly. "Then what will you do?" The king looked down at his palm again, at the mark that would not stop humming, that would not let him forget her voice, her scent, the way she had looked at him, as though she could see straight through his mask to whatever lay underneath. "I am going to find her," he said. Edric opened his mouth to argue, but something in the king's expression stopped him. He had known this man since they were boys running through the palace halls together, had watched him grow into a ruler burdened by duty and surrounded by people who wanted things from him. He had rarely seen him look the way he looked now, unsettled, almost desperate, entirely unlike the composed king the kingdom believed him to be. "All right," Edric said finally, but quietly. "If word of this spreads before you understand what you are dealing with, it could cause more trouble than you can imagine." The king nodded, though his mind was already elsewhere, already reaching for the fading thread of her scent that lingered somewhere beyond the garden walls. He did not know her name. He did not know her rank, her family, or her place among his people. He knew only that his wolf had chosen her in an instant, without his permission, without his understanding, and that no matter what his council wanted, no matter what tradition demanded, some deep and ancient part of him now refused to let her go. The masquerade continued around him, glittering and oblivious, while somewhere beyond the palace walls, a woman he had never properly met sat alone in the dark, staring at a mark on her shoulder that would change both their lives forever. Neither of them yet understood how far this bond would reach, how many lives it would touch, or how many people would try to tear it apart before the truth came fully into the light. All they knew, in this first quiet, terrifying hour, was that something ancient and unstoppable had been set into motion, and there would be no going back from it now. The king removed his mask once he reached the privacy of his own chambers, setting it down on a table beside a window that looked out over the sleeping city. He studied the mark on his palm in the moonlight, watching it pulse in a slow, steady rhythm. It felt nothing like a mistake. It felt like the truest thing he had ever done. And that terrified him more than anything else that had happened all night. Because kings were not permitted to feel this way about a stranger. Kings were expected to choose mates who strengthened alliances, who came from powerful packs, who understood the weight of ruling a kingdom. Kings were not supposed to lose themselves in a single dance, a single kiss, a single moment of instinct they could not control. Yet here he stood, marked and bound, his wolf finally quiet for the first time in years, calmed by a bond he had never asked for and could not imagine giving up. Somewhere out there she was afraid. He could feel it, faintly, through the thread connecting them, a distant hum of fear and confusion that matched his own. He pressed his hand against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the dark rooftops of the city, and made a silent promise to the woman he had not yet properly met. He would find her. He would understand what had happened between them. And whatever it cost him, he would not let his counsel convince him to undo the one thing in his life that had ever felt completely and undeniably right. The king did not sleep that night. He lay in his bed with his palm pressed against his chest, feeling the mark pulse in time with a heartbeat that was not his own, and every time he closed his eyes he saw her face in the moonlight, the curve of her jaw beneath a mask of silver feathers, the way her eyes had widened just before she ran. By dawn, his restlessness had turned into something sharper. His wolf paced beneath his skin like a caged animal, refusing to settle, refusing to let him think of anything except the direction his instincts pulled him. It was a strange and uncomfortable sensation for a man who had spent his entire life in complete command of himself. He was used to controlling armies, treaties, and the moods of an entire kingdom. He was not used to being unable to control his own body. Edric arrived at his chambers just after sunrise, already dressed and clearly exhausted from a night of his own, having spent hours quietly asking questions among the guards about a woman in a green gown and silver mask. He found the king standing at the window, staring out at the city as though he could see straight through the rooftops to wherever she was hiding. "You look terrible," Edric said. "I feel worse," the king admitted. "Did you sleep at all?" "No." Edric crossed the room and studied his friend carefully. There was a tension in the king's shoulders that had nothing to do with politics or war, a rawness in his expression that Edric had rarely seen, not even during the darkest days of his rule. Whatever had happened at the masquerade, it had changed something fundamental in him. "I asked around," Edric said. "No one saw her leave through the main gates. A few guards mentioned a side entrance near the garden wall, used mostly by staff and lesser nobles trying to avoid the crowds. If she left that way, she could be anyone, a merchant's daughter, a servant's relative, even someone who was never meant to be there at all." The king turned from the window, meaning she may not be part of the noble houses, meaning, Edric said carefully. "This could be far more complicated than you are prepared for." The king said nothing. He understood exactly what Edric meant. If the woman he had marked was not a member of the visiting delegations, not connected to any of the powerful packs currently vying for alliance with the crown, then his council would see this bond not as an accident to be managed quietly, but as a dangerous mistake threatening the stability of the entire kingdom. An alpha king's mate was never simply a matter of the heart. It was a matter of politics, power, and lineage, and a bond formed with someone outside that careful architecture could unravel years of delicate negotiation. And yet, despite understanding all of this, despite knowing exactly what his advisors would say the moment they learned the truth, the king felt no urge whatsoever to undo what had happened. If anything, the thought of severing the bond made his wolf recoil with something close to violence. "I need to find her," he said again, his voice quiet but resolute. "Whoever she is." "And when you find her," Edric asked, "what will you do?" The king did not have an answer yet. He only knew that the ache in his chest would not fade until he saw her again, until he understood the woman his wolf had chosen without permission from either of them. By mid-morning, the palace was already buzzing with rumors, though thankfully none of them had reached the true cause of the king's distraction. Servants whispered about his sleepless appearance at breakfast. Council members exchanged concerned glances at his uncharacteristic silence during the morning briefing. His mother, the Dowager Queen Rosalind, watched him from across the long dining table with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had ruled at his father's side for decades and missed very little. "You are distracted," she said finally, once the servants had cleared away the morning meal and left them alone. "I am tired," the king replied. "You are many things this morning, but tired is not the one troubling me most." Rosalind set down her tea and studied her son carefully. Something happened at the masquerade. The king considered lying, but he had never been able to hide much from his mother, not since he was a boy sneaking sweets from the kitchens. He held up his palm instead, revealing the faint glow of the mark still pulsing beneath his skin. Rosalind's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine alarm. "You marked someone," she said quietly. "Yes. Who?" "I don't know." His mother stared at him for a long moment, clearly waiting for some further explanation, some reasonable context that would make sense of what he had just told her. When none came, she set her cup down with a soft, deliberate clink. "You marked a stranger," she said, "at a masquerade attended by every eligible noble in the kingdom, and you do not even know her name." "She was wearing a mask. I never saw her face fully. She ran before I could ask." "And you let her run." "It happened too quickly for either of us to understand what was occurring," the king said, frustration creeping into his voice. "My wolf has never behaved this way before, not once, not with anyone I have ever met. I do not fully understand it myself." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying her son with an expression that mixed worry with something almost like sympathy. She had loved his father in exactly this way, a bond formed swiftly and completely, though under far calmer circumstances than a masked encounter in a moonlit garden. "If this is a true bond," she said finally, "severing it will not be simple. The council will want to try, of course. They will see an unknown Omega as a threat to every alliance we have carefully built over the years. But breaking a true mate bond by force can cause serious harm, sometimes lasting harm, to both parties involved. It is not something to attempt lightly. I have no intention of severing it," the king said. His mother studied him carefully, searching his face for the truth behind his words. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and reached across the table to rest her hand over his. "Then you had better find her quickly," she said, "before the council discovers what has happened on their own and decides the matter for you." The king spent the rest of the day attempting to focus on the affairs of the kingdom, meeting with ambassadors, reviewing reports from the eastern border, listening to petitions from villages struggling after a difficult harvest. But his mind kept drifting back to the garden, to the warmth of her hand in his, to the sound of her voice asking who he was. By evening he could not bear the waiting any longer. He changed into simple clothing, the kind worn by ordinary merchants rather than kings, and slipped out through a side entrance of the palace with Edric close behind him, determined to follow whatever thread of instinct still connected him to the woman he had marked. The bond pulled at him like a current, faint but unmistakable, drawing him through the winding streets of the lower city, past markets closing for the evening, and taverns filling with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. He followed it without fully understanding how he knew the way, trusting the ancient instinct humming beneath his skin. Eventually, the pull led him to the edge of town, to a modest cottage tucked beside a small healer's shop, its windows glowing with soft candlelight against the darkening sky. He stopped at the edge of the path, staring at the building, feeling his heart pound harder than it had during any battle he had ever fought. "This is it," he murmured. Edric glanced at the cottage, then back at his friend. "Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything." Meanwhile, inside the cottage, Elara sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a cup of untouched tea, her mind replaying the events of the previous night over and over. She had barely slept either, haunted by the memory of amber eyes behind a black mask, and terrified by the mark still glowing faintly on her shoulder. She had told no one the full truth. Not even Ren, who had stopped by that morning full of questions about how the masquerade had gone. Alara had claimed exhaustion and sent her friend away, unable to explain what had happened, without revealing the impossible truth she was still struggling to accept. A knock at the door made her jump. She rose slowly, smoothing her simple dress, and opened the door expecting Ren returning with more questions. Instead, she found the masked stranger from the garden standing on her doorstep, no longer wearing his mask, his face fully visible for the first time. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him instantly, not from the masquerade, but from portraits hung throughout the kingdom, from coins stamped with his profile, from every official proclamation that bore his seal. Standing before her, looking as uncertain and overwhelmed as she felt, was Alpha King Callan Ashgrove himself. "You," she whispered, stepping back in shock. "Please," Callan said quickly, raising his hands as though to reassure her he meant no harm. "I know this is impossible to understand. I know I have no right to appear here uninvited, but I could not leave things as they were between us." Alara stared at him, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once, terror and disbelief, and something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to relief at seeing him again. "You're the king," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Callan admitted. "And you marked me." "Yes." Ilara's hand rose instinctively to her shoulder, pressing against the fabric covering the mark beneath. "Why?" Callan hesitated, searching for words that might explain something he barely understood himself. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I have never lost control like that before, not once in my entire life. But the moment I touched your hand, something in me simply knew." "Knew what?" "That you were mine," he said quietly, "whether either of us wanted it or not." Ilara stood frozen in her doorway, staring at the man who ruled her entire kingdom, a man she had never expected to see again, let alone standing uninvited on her doorstep, claiming a bond neither of them had chosen, but neither of them could escape. Behind him, Edric shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two of them with the expression of a man watching something enormous unfold and uncertain of what to do about it. "I don't understand any of this," Ilara said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm no one. I'm a healer's assistant. I have no family name worth mentioning, no place among your nobles. Whatever this bond is, it cannot be real. It cannot be allowed." "It is real," Callan said softly. "Whether it is allowed or not is a different question entirely, and one I intend to answer for myself." Ilara studied his face, searching for some sign of deception, some hint that this was a cruel joke or a test of loyalty designed to trap her. She found nothing but sincerity, raw and unguarded, the same look she had seen behind his mask the night before. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Callan held her gaze steadily, his voice calm despite the storm clearly raging beneath his composed exterior. "Now," he said, "we figure out together what this bond means, and what we are going to do about it." Ilara did not invite him inside that evening. She was not ready for that, not yet, not with her mind still spinning from the impossibility of it all. But she did not close the door either, and as she stood there in the fading evening light, staring at the Alpha King of her entire kingdom, she felt the mark on her shoulder pulse warmly, as though it too understood that nothing about her life would ever be simple again. News of the king's late-night visit to a healer's cottage on the edge of town spread through the lower city faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the story had already twisted and grown in the retelling, until half the market square believed the king had fallen suddenly and mysteriously ill and required urgent healing, while the other half whispered about a secret romance far more scandalous than anyone dared say aloud in public. Ilara heard the rumors from Ren, who arrived at the cottage breathless and wide-eyed, practically bursting through the door before Ilara had even finished her morning tea. "Everyone is talking about it," Ren said, dropping into a chair across from her. "The king, here, at your door, last night. Ilara, what is happening?" Ilara set down her cup carefully, choosing her words with great caution. She trusted Ren completely, but she was not yet ready to explain the full truth, not until she understood it herself. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Complicated," Ren repeated, raising an eyebrow. "The Alpha King of the entire kingdom visits your cottage in the middle of the night, and all you have to say is complicated." Ilara sighed, running a hand over her face. She had not slept well again, her dreams filled with amber eyes and warm hands, and a pull in her chest that refused to quiet no matter how far apart she and Callan currently were. "Something happened at the masquerade," Ilara admitted slowly. "Something neither of us intended." She told Ren everything then, the dance, the garden, the mark. watching her friend's expression shift from disbelief to shock to something like fearful concern as the full weight of the situation became clear. A true bond, Ren whispered once Alara had finished, with the king himself. Alara, do you understand what this means? His council will never accept an Omega with no family name, no noble blood, no political value. They will try to end it. I know, Alara said quietly. Callan said as much himself. And what does he intend to do about that? Alara hesitated. She thought of Callan standing on her doorstep the night before, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes, insisting the bond was real regardless of what tradition demanded. She thought of the way her wolf had gone calm and warm in his presence, as though some ancient part of her recognized something her mind still struggled to accept. He said we would figure it out together, she said finally. Ren studied her carefully. And what do you want? It was a question Alara had been avoiding since the moment she woke that morning, too afraid of the answer to examine it closely. She wanted, more than anything, for her life to return to the simple, quiet existence she had known before the masquerade, tending to patients, learning healing arts from her mentor, living without the weight of politics or palace intrigue pressing down upon her. And yet when she closed her eyes, she still felt the warmth of Callan's hand against hers, still heard the low, steady sound of his voice promising he would not simply walk away from what had happened between them. I don't know, she admitted honestly, but I don't think I can pretend none of this happened either. Across the city, inside the palace walls, Callan faced a far less sympathetic reception from his council. Word of his midnight excursion had reached the ears of his advisors just as quickly as it had spread through the lower city, and by mid-morning he found himself summoned to an emergency meeting he had no wish to attend. 7 council members sat around the long stone table in the chamber reserved for matters of state, their faces arranged in various expressions of concern, disapproval, and outright alarm. Lord Bertram Hollis, the eldest and most traditional among them, spoke first, his voice sharp with barely contained frustration. Your Majesty, he began, we have heard troubling reports regarding your activities last evening. I am aware of the rumors, Callan said calmly, taking his seat at the head of the table. Then perhaps you can clarify them for us, Lord Hollis continued. Is it true that you formed a bond with an unknown Omega during the masquerade, a woman with no noble lineage, no political connections, and no place among the visiting delegations? Callan considered his answer carefully. He had known this conversation was coming, had spent much of the previous night preparing himself for it, and yet facing the disapproval of his entire council still weighed heavily on him. It is true, he said finally. A ripple of murmurs passed around the table. Lady Miriam Ashcombe, seated near the center, leaned forward with sharp interest. And this woman, this healer's assistant, she has accepted the bond? We are still discussing what the bond means for both of us, Callan said. There is nothing to discuss, Lord Hollis interjected. A true mate bond formed with someone outside the noble houses threatens every alliance this kingdom has carefully built over the past decade. We have negotiations pending with 3 separate pacts, all of whom expect your marriage to strengthen ties between our territories. An unknown Omega with no family name changes everything. The bond is not something I chose deliberately, Callan said, keeping his voice steady despite the frustration building in his chest. It happened through instinct, through my wolf's own recognition, something beyond my conscious control. Then it can be undone, Lady Ashcombe said simply. There are rituals, difficult and rare, but not impossible, that can sever an unwanted bond. If your wolf acted without your permission, surely correcting the mistake serves everyone's best interests. Callan felt his wolf stir violently beneath his skin at the mere suggestion, a surge of protective fury that startled him with its intensity. He had expected resistance from his council, had prepared himself for arguments about politics and tradition, but the physical reaction to the idea of severing the bond caught him entirely off guard. No, he said, more forcefully than he intended. The table fell silent. Your Majesty, Lord Hollis said carefully. I understand this situation is unusual, but surely you recognize the danger of allowing personal instinct to override the needs of the entire kingdom. I recognize, Callan said, standing slowly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him respect from even his harshest critics, that this bond is not something either of us anticipated, and not something either of us can simply undo without risking serious harm. Attempting to sever a true bond by force carries real danger my own mother has warned me about directly. I will not risk the life of an innocent woman simply because her lineage fails to meet the standards this council prefers. Lady Ashcombe's expression tightened. Then what do you propose instead? Callan considered his answer carefully. He had spent the entire night thinking through this exact question. weighing the demands of his crown against instincts he could not fully explain, and had arrived at a solution he knew would not please everyone gathered around this table. "I propose," he said, "that the woman in question be brought to the palace under my protection, while we determine together the full nature of this bond, and what it means for both of us moving forward. This is not a decision I intend to rush, nor one I intend to make without proper consideration, but it is a decision that will be made carefully, and on my own terms." The council exchanged uneasy glances, clearly displeased but recognizing the firm resolve in their king's voice. Even Lord Hollis, for all his objections, understood that pushing further in this particular moment would accomplish little beyond deepening the divide already forming between the crown and its advisors. "Very well," Lord Hollis said finally, though his tone carried little genuine acceptance. "But be warned, Your Majesty, this council will not simply stand aside while an unproven Omega threatens the stability of alliances built over generations. If this bond proves as dangerous as we fear, we will act to protect the kingdom, with or without your blessing." Callan met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. "Then I suggest," he said, "that you hope the bond proves exactly as harmless as I believe it to be." The meeting ended shortly after, the council dispersing with quiet murmurs and uneasy glances, leaving Callan alone in the stone chamber with his thoughts. He pressed his palm against the cool surface of the table, feeling the mark pulse gently beneath his skin, and allowed himself a brief moment to consider the full weight of what he had just promised. He had defied his counsel for a woman he had known less than a full day. He had risked the stability of alliances his kingdom depended upon, all because his wolf refused to let go of a stranger in a green silk gown. And yet, despite the enormous risk, despite the very real danger of angering the powerful families his kingdom relied upon, Callan felt no regret whatsoever. If anything, he felt a strange and unfamiliar sense of certainty, a conviction that whatever happened next, walking away from Alara was simply not an option his heart would allow. He sent for Edric immediately, instructing him to arrange for Alara's transport to the palace under the guise of protective custody, careful phrasing meant to shield her from the harshest scrutiny of the court, while the full situation remained unresolved. Edric returned within the hour, his expression carefully neutral. "She is not going to like this," he warned. "I know," Callan admitted. "She values her independence. Uprooting her entire life to move into the palace, surrounded by nobles who already resent her existence, will not be an easy transition." "I know that as well," Callan said quietly. "But leaving her exposed to whatever danger this bond might attract is far worse than any discomfort she might feel within these walls." Edric studied his friend carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the restless energy that had not faded since the masquerade. "You care for her already," he observed. "Beyond the bond itself." Callan considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't fully understand what I feel yet," he admitted, "but I know that the thought of anything happening to her, of losing her before I even properly know her, is unbearable to me, in a way I cannot explain through instinct alone." Edric nodded slowly, understanding settling over his expression. "Then I will make the arrangements," he said. "But be prepared, my friend. Bringing her here will not end your troubles. It may only be the beginning of them." Callan looked out toward the window, toward the distant edge of the lower city where Alara's small cottage stood beneath the morning sun, and felt the mark on his palm pulse warmly, as though answering a question he had not yet asked aloud. Whatever troubles awaited them within the palace walls, he was ready to face them, so long as it meant keeping her safe, and keeping the bond that had already become the truest thing in his life. The carriage that arrived outside Alara's cottage the following afternoon was far grander than anything she had ever seen up close. Polished dark wood trimmed with silver, pulled by two matching horses whose harnesses gleamed in the sunlight. She stared at it through her window for a long moment before finally gathering the courage to open her door. Edric stood beside the carriage, dressed in formal palace attire, his expression polite but unreadable. Beside him stood two guards, present more for appearance than any real necessity, their postures relaxed despite the formality of the occasion. "Miss Finch," Edric said, offering a respectful bow. "I am Edric Hale, advisor and friend to His Majesty. I have come to escort you to the palace, per the king's request." Alara's stomach tightened. She had known this moment was coming, had spent the entire previous day trying to prepare herself for it, and yet standing here now, facing the reality of leaving her small, familiar life behind, felt far more overwhelming than she had anticipated. "And if I refuse?" she asked carefully. Edric's expression softened slightly, a flicker of genuine sympathy crossing his features. "You are not a prisoner, Miss Finch. The king has been very clear on that point, but I would ask you to consider the danger of remaining here. exposed and unprotected, now that word of the bond has begun spreading through the city. There are those who might see an unguarded Omega marked by the crown as an opportunity, whether for blackmail, kidnapping, or worse. Elara had not considered that particular danger, and the thought sent a cold chill through her chest. She thought of Ren, of her elderly mentor at the healer's shop, of the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself over the years, and understood with sudden clarity that none of it was truly safe anymore, not now that she carried the mark of an Alpha King on her shoulder. "Give me a moment to gather my things," she said finally. She packed quickly, taking only what mattered most, her healing tools, a few changes of simple clothing, a small portrait of her late mother she kept on her bedside table. Ren arrived just as she finished, tears in her eyes as she embraced her friend tightly. "You will write to me," Ren said, her voice thick with emotion. "Promise me." "I promise," Elara said, though she had no idea yet what freedoms or restrictions palace life might impose upon her. The carriage ride through the city drew curious stares from every direction, merchants and townsfolk pausing their daily business to watch the royal carriage pass, whispers following in its wake. Elara sat rigidly upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to steady her racing heart, as the palace gates grew steadily closer. The palace itself was even more overwhelming up close than it had appeared from the ballroom 2 nights before. Towering stone walls rose high above the surrounding city, gleaming white in the afternoon sun, while gardens stretched in every direction, filled with flowers Elara had only ever read about in books. Callan met her personally at the entrance, dismissing the formal guard escort with a simple wave of his hand. He looked different in daylight than he had beneath his mask, his features sharper, more clearly defined, though his amber eyes remained exactly as striking as she remembered. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I didn't feel I had much choice," Elara admitted honestly. Something flickered across Callan's expression, guilt perhaps, or regret, though he quickly composed himself. "I know this is not easy for you," he said. "I know you did not ask for any of this. But I promise you, within these walls, you will be safe." Elara studied him carefully, searching for the same sincerity she had glimpsed on her doorstep the night before. She found it there still, steady and unwavering, and though her nerves remained tightly wound, she felt a small measure of comfort settle over her. "Show me where I will be staying," she said finally. Callan led her personally through the palace halls, past portraits of previous kings and queens, past grand windows overlooking the sprawling gardens below, until they reached a wing of the palace reserved for honored guests. The chambers he showed her were more luxurious than anything she had ever imagined, a spacious bedroom with silk curtains, an adjoining sitting room, and a private balcony overlooking the eastern gardens. "This is too much," Elara said quietly, overwhelmed by the sheer opulence surrounding her. "It is simply where you will be comfortable," Callan said. "Nothing more." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from the corridor, and Elara turned to find a striking woman standing in the doorway, her dark hair pulled into an elegant style, her expression cold and calculating as she assessed Elara from head to toe. "So this is her," the woman said, her voice carrying a sharp edge of disdain. "The healer's assistant who somehow captured our king's attention." "Serena," Callan said, his tone carrying a warning Elara did not fully understand yet. "This is not the time." Serena Voss, Elara would soon learn, was the daughter of one of the kingdom's most powerful pack leaders, a woman who had spent years being groomed as the most likely candidate for the king's eventual mate. Her family's alliance with the crown had been carefully cultivated for over a decade, and the sudden appearance of an unknown Omega threatened everything she had been raised to expect. "Forgive my bluntness," Serena said, her smile sharp despite her polite words. "But surely you understand my confusion, Miss Finch. You have no family name of note, no political standing, no experience whatsoever in matters of court or leadership. And yet here you stand, marked by the Alpha King himself, as though such an honor were simply handed out on a whim." "I did not ask for this," Elara said carefully, refusing to let the woman's condescension shake her composure entirely. "Perhaps not," Serena replied, "but you have certainly not refused it either." "That is enough," Callan said firmly, stepping slightly forward, his voice carrying the authority Elara had not yet heard him use. "Elara is under my protection, and she will be treated with the respect that deserves, regardless of any personal feelings you may hold about the situation." Serena's expression tightened, though she quickly smoothed it back into practiced elegance. "Of course, Your Majesty," she said, offering a shallow bow before turning and walking away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Once she had gone, Elara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "That was Serena Voss," she said quietly. more statement than question. Yes, Callan admitted. Her family has long expected an alliance between us. This situation has complicated matters considerably, for everyone involved. She hates me already. She is afraid, Callan corrected gently. Afraid of losing a future she has been promised for years. That fear does not excuse her behavior, but it does explain it, at least in part. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling very small and out of place within these grand, unfamiliar halls. Everyone here is going to look at me exactly the way she just did, she said quietly, aren't they? Callan stepped closer, his expression softening as he studied her carefully. Perhaps some will, he admitted honestly. Court can be a cruel place, filled with people who value lineage and politics above all else. But I promise you, Alara, you are not alone in this. Whatever challenges arise, we will face them together. Alara looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation, and found only steady resolve staring back at her. Despite everything, despite the overwhelming strangeness of her new surroundings, despite the hostility she had already encountered, something in his presence settled the anxious churning in her chest. I don't know how to be part of any of this, she admitted quietly. Court, politics, palace life. I'm a healer. That's all I've ever known how to be. Then be that, Callan said simply. I am not asking you to become someone else. I am only asking you to give this bond, and this strange, unexpected situation we find ourselves in, a genuine chance before deciding it cannot work. Alara considered his words carefully, feeling the mark on her shoulder pulse gently beneath her dress, as though echoing his sentiment. She thought of Wren's tearful embrace, of the quiet cottage she had left behind, of the frightening uncertainty of everything that lay ahead of her now. And yet, standing here in this unfamiliar palace, facing a king who had defied his own counsel for her sake, she found herself, despite every rational fear, willing to try. All right, she said finally. I'll stay. For now. Something like relief passed across Callan's features, though he quickly composed himself, offering her a small, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Thank you, he said quietly. Outside, in the corridor beyond Alara's new chambers, Serena Voss stood pressed against the cool stone wall, having lingered longer than she should have after her confrontation, listening to the muffled conversation drifting through the door, her hands curled into fists at her sides, her carefully composed expression finally cracking to reveal the raw fury simmering beneath. She had spent years preparing for the role of queen, years learning the intricate politics of court, years cultivating alliances and favor, with exactly this future in mind. She would not simply allow some healer's assistant, some nobody with no family name and no proper understanding of court life, to steal that future away from her without a fight. Whatever it took, Serena decided, whatever methods proved necessary, she would find a way to remove Alara Finch from the palace and reclaim the future she had been promised since childhood. The bond between the king and his unexpected Omega might be strong, ancient, and difficult to break by force. But Serena Voss had never been the type of woman to accept defeat easily. And as she turned and walked away from Alara's chambers, her mind already racing with possibilities, she made a silent vow to herself that this was far from over. The first week inside the palace tested Alara's patience in ways she had never before experienced. Every meal became an exercise in careful navigation, nobles watching her every movement with barely concealed judgment, whispering behind gloved hands whenever she reached for the wrong fork or hesitated over unfamiliar customs. She had never needed to know which spoon belonged to which course, had never needed to understand the complicated hierarchy of who addressed whom first during formal gatherings, and every mistake felt like fresh evidence supporting the court's belief that she did not belong among them. Serena Voss, in particular, seemed to take great pleasure in pointing out each misstep, always with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, always phrased in a way that made genuine correction impossible to refuse without appearing rude. Perhaps someone ought to instruct her properly, Serena remarked loudly during one particular dinner, watching Alara struggle with an unfamiliar arrangement of silverware. It seems unfair to expect a healer's assistant to understand customs she was never taught. Alara felt her cheeks burn, though she forced herself to remain composed, refusing to give Serena the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Across the table, Callan's jaw tightened, though he said nothing in the moment, clearly unwilling to escalate the tension further in front of the assembled nobles. Later that evening, after the other guests had retired, Callan found Alara alone on her private balcony, staring out at the gardens below, her expression troubled. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, joining her at the railing. "I felt like a fool," Alara admitted quietly. Everyone in that room was waiting for me to make a mistake, and I gave them plenty to watch. No one expects you to know customs you were never taught, Callan said gently. That expectation is unfair, and anyone suggesting otherwise is simply looking for reasons to make you feel small. Ilara glanced at him sideways. Serena, you mean? Callan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Serena has her own reasons for behaving as she does. That does not excuse her cruelty, but it does explain it. She has spent years preparing for a future she believed was guaranteed to her, and watching that future slip away has clearly brought out the worst in her. Do you think I'm making a mistake by staying here? Ilara asked quietly, voicing the doubt that had been growing steadily since her arrival. Perhaps everyone is right. Perhaps I don't belong in a place like this. Callan turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Ilara, listen to me carefully. Belonging is not something determined by family name or noble blood. It is something earned through character, through kindness, through the way a person treats others regardless of their own circumstances. I have watched you these past several days, and I have seen nothing but grace under pressure, patience despite unfair treatment, and genuine warmth toward the palace staff who have shown you kindness. That is worth far more than knowing which fork to use during dinner. Ilara felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, a comfort she had not expected to find within these unfamiliar walls. You truly believe that, she said softly. I do, Callan said, his voice steady and sincere, and I intend to make certain the rest of this court learns to see you the way I already do. Over the following days, despite the lingering tension surrounding her presence, Ilara slowly began to find her footing within the palace. She spent mornings assisting the palace healer, a kind, elderly wolf named Master Aldrich, who welcomed her knowledge and experience with genuine enthusiasm rather than judgment. You have a gift, Master Aldrich told her one morning, watching her carefully tend to a young servant's injured hand. A gentle touch, combined with genuine understanding of the healing arts. Not something easily taught, my dear. Not something every healer possesses, regardless of their training. The praise meant more to Ilara than she expected, a reminder that her worth extended far beyond the narrow judgments of court nobility. She began spending more time in the healer's quarters, finding purpose and comfort in familiar work, even as the rest of palace life remained a constant, uncertain adjustment. Her relationship with Callan, meanwhile, continued to deepen in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. What had begun as an accidental bond forged through instinct alone slowly transformed into something built on genuine understanding and growing affection. They spent evenings walking together through the palace gardens, Callan sharing stories of his childhood, the pressures of ruling a kingdom from such a young age, the loneliness that came with being surrounded by advisors and courtiers who wanted things from him rather than simply wanting to know him. Everyone expects something from me, he admitted one evening as they walked beneath rows of blooming roses. My council wants strategic alliances. The nobles want favor and influence. Even my own mother, as much as she loves me, wants grandchildren to secure the succession. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people, and yet I have rarely felt truly known by any of them. And what do you want? Ilara asked quietly. Callan considered the question seriously before answering. I want, he said slowly, someone who sees me as simply myself, not as a crown or a title or a political opportunity. Someone who values my company for its own sake, rather than for what I can provide them. Ilara studied his profile in the moonlight, understanding suddenly the weight he carried, a burden invisible to most who only saw the polished, composed king presented to the public. I think, she said softly, that I might understand that loneliness better than you realize. I have spent my entire life on the outside of things, watching others move through a world that never quite made space for me. Perhaps that is something we share, despite everything else that separates us. Callan turned to look at her fully, something warm and vulnerable passing across his expression. Perhaps it is, he agreed quietly. Their fingers brushed together as they continued walking, and Ilara felt the familiar warmth of the bond pulse gently between them, no longer frightening as it had once seemed, but comforting in its steady, constant presence. Her wolf, once anxious and unsettled by the sudden bond forced upon her, had gradually calmed in Callan's presence, finding in him not a threat or an obligation, but something closer to genuine companionship. She found herself looking forward to their evening walks, to quiet conversations shared over tea, to the small, unguarded smiles Callan offered her when he thought no one else was watching. It was during one such evening, weeks into her stay at the palace, that Ilara finally allowed herself to acknowledge feelings she had been carefully avoiding since her arrival. I think, she said quietly, as they sat together on a stone bench overlooking the eastern gardens, that I am beginning to care for you. Not because of the bond, or because of instinct, but simply because of who you are. Callan's breath caught slightly, and he turned to face her fully, his amber eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Ilara," he said softly, "I have felt the same way for some time now. I was simply afraid to say so, worried that my own feelings might be influenced too heavily by the bond itself, rather than genuine affection freely given." "And now?" Ilara asked quietly. "Do you still worry about that?" Callan reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle and reverent. "No," he said. "I know now, without any doubt, that what I feel for you extends far beyond instinct alone." Ilara leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of the bond hum steadily between them, no longer a burden imposed upon her without consent, but something she was slowly, carefully choosing for herself. Yet even as their relationship deepened, the tension within the palace continued simmering beneath the surface, Serena's resentment growing sharper with each passing day, the council's disapproval never fully fading despite Callan's steady resolve. Somewhere within the palace walls, dangerous plans were already beginning to form, threats neither Ilara nor Callan yet fully understood, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. For now, though, beneath the moonlight and blooming roses, Ilara allowed herself simply to enjoy this fragile, growing happiness, unaware of how soon it would be tested by forces far beyond her control. Word of the growing closeness between the king and his marked Omega spread quickly through the palace, and though many nobles remained skeptical, a surprising number of servants and lower staff began to warm toward Ilara, drawn to her genuine kindness and lack of pretension. She remembered the names of stable hands and kitchen workers alike, thanked them sincerely for even the smallest tasks, and treated everyone she encountered with the same respect regardless of their station. Master Aldrich noticed the shift most clearly, watching with quiet satisfaction as Ilara's confidence grew alongside her skills. "You are becoming quite popular among the staff," he told her one afternoon as they worked together preparing herbal remedies for the palace infirmary. "They speak highly of you in the kitchens." "I simply try to treat people the way I would want to be treated," Ilara said, measuring dried herbs carefully into a small pouch. "A simple philosophy," Aldrich said, smiling, "though rarer among nobility than one might hope. It is no surprise the staff have taken to you so quickly. You remind them, I think, that kindness matters more than lineage." Ilara appreciated his words, though she remained acutely aware that not everyone within the palace shared his perspective. Serena's hostility had not softened in the slightest, and if anything, seemed to be growing more calculated with each passing week, her sharp comments during public gatherings replaced by quieter, more private attempts to undermine Ilara's confidence. One afternoon, while Ilara walked alone through the palace library searching for a particular healing text, Serena appeared unexpectedly from behind a tall bookshelf, her expression carefully composed into something almost friendly. "Miss Finch," she said smoothly, "I wondered if we might speak privately for a moment." Ilara eyed her warily, unaccustomed to Serena approaching her without an audience of nobles to witness the exchange. "Of course," she said carefully. Serena studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I imagine you have noticed the tension surrounding your presence here," she said. "The council's concerns, the whispers among the nobility. I wonder if you have considered what remaining here might ultimately cost you." "Cost me," Ilara repeated slowly. "The bond between you and the king is strong, yes," Serena continued, her voice deceptively gentle. "But bonds, even strong ones, can create as much suffering as happiness when circumstances refuse to align properly. You are not equipped for this life, Miss Finch. You were not raised for it, trained for it, prepared for the endless scrutiny and political maneuvering that comes with standing beside a king. Have you considered that perhaps, despite the bond, the kindest thing you could do for both yourself and Callan would be to step aside gracefully, before this situation grows more complicated than either of you can manage?" Ilara felt a chill settle over her at Serena's words, though she forced herself to remain composed, refusing to let the other woman see how deeply the suggestion unsettled her. "Is that concern for my well-being," she asked carefully, "or concern for your own ambitions?" Something flickered across Serena's expression, quickly hidden beneath practiced composure. "Perhaps both," she admitted, surprising Ilara with her honesty. "I will not pretend I have no personal stake in this matter, but that does not make my warning any less true. This life will consume you eventually, Miss Finch, if you allow it to continue. Better to leave now, on your own terms, than to be forced out later under far more painful circumstances." Serena turned and walked away before Ilara could respond, leaving her alone among the towering bookshelves, Serena's words echoing uncomfortably in her mind. That evening, Ilara found herself unusually quiet during dinner, distracted by the conversation with Serena, wondering despite herself whether there was truth buried within the other woman's cruel warning. Callan noticed her distraction immediately, and once the meal concluded, he gently guided her toward the privacy of the palace gardens. "Something is troubling you," he said, once they were alone beneath the evening stars. Alara hesitated before finally sharing the details of her encounter with Serena, watching Callan's expression harden as she spoke. "She has no right to speak to you that way," he said firmly, once she finished. "Perhaps she isn't entirely wrong," Alara admitted quietly, voicing the fear she had been carrying since the confrontation. "I don't know the first thing about ruling a kingdom, about navigating court politics, about being the kind of partner a king truly needs. What if she's right, Callan? What if I'm not equipped for this life, and my presence here only causes you more difficulty than happiness?" Callan turned to face her fully, taking both her hands gently in his own. "Alara, listen to me," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "I do not need someone who already understands court politics or noble customs. I have advisors and councils full of people who understand those things perfectly well, and most of them care more about their own ambitions than about me as a person. What I need, what I have never had until you arrived, is someone who sees me clearly, who cares for me honestly, who reminds me that there is more to life than duty and obligation. You give me that, Alara, simply by being yourself. But the council," Alara pressed. "Serena, the constant tension surrounding my presence here, doesn't that trouble you?" "Of course it troubles me," Callan admitted honestly, "but it troubles me because it causes you pain, not because I doubt whether keeping you here is the right choice. I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of my feelings for you, bond or no bond. Serena's fears about her own future do not change that truth, no matter how she tries to frame her warnings as concern for your well-being." Alara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly, "not of you, or even of the bond itself anymore. I'm frightened of everything surrounding it, the politics, the danger, the constant sense that people are working against us even when we cannot see it happening." Callan pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close beneath the star-filled sky. "I understand that fear," he said softly. "I feel it too, more often than I would like to admit. But I would rather face that uncertainty alongside you than return to the empty, lonely certainty of a life without you in it." They stood together in comfortable silence for several long minutes, the warmth of the bond settling steadily between them, offering quiet reassurance despite the uncertainty still surrounding their future. Unbeknownst to either of them, their conversation had been overheard by a figure watching from the shadows of a nearby hedge, one of Serena's most trusted allies among the palace staff, quietly gathering information to report back to his mistress later that evening. Serena received the news with quiet satisfaction, understanding immediately that gentle persuasion alone would not be enough to separate Alara from the king's affections. If words could not accomplish what she needed, then more drastic measures would eventually become necessary. She began, that very night, planning something far more dangerous than simple warnings and veiled threats, reaching out quietly to contacts within her own family's pack, individuals who shared her frustration with the current situation and possessed the resources necessary to address it more permanently. Whatever scheme was forming in Serena's mind, it would soon threaten not only the growing bond between Alara and Callan, but the safety of everyone within the palace walls, setting into motion events that would test the strength of their connection far beyond anything either of them had yet experienced. For now, beneath the peaceful evening sky, Alara and Callan remained blissfully unaware of the danger quietly gathering around them, content simply to hold each other close, trusting that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first sign of real danger arrived nearly a month after Alara had settled into palace life, carried by a messenger who arrived at the gates just after midnight, exhausted and travel-worn, bearing urgent news from the eastern border. Callan was summoned from his chambers immediately, and Alara, sensing the tension pulsing through the bond even from a distance, rose from her own bed and made her way toward the council chamber, unable to shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. She arrived just as the messenger finished delivering his report, and the grim expressions on the faces of Callan and his advisors told her immediately that the news was not good. "What has happened?" she asked quietly, stepping into the chamber despite the surprised glances from several council members unaccustomed to her presence during official matters. Callan turned toward her, his expression tense but not unwelcoming. "A rival pack from beyond the eastern border has learned of our bond," he said carefully. "They see it as evidence of instability within the crown, an opportunity to press old territorial claims they have long wanted to pursue. They believe," Edric added grimly, that a king distracted by a bond formed outside proper political channels represents weakness, weakness they intend to exploit. Alara felt her stomach twist with dread. What does that mean exactly? She asked. What are they planning to do? Lord Hollis, seated near the head of the table, answered before Callan could speak. Our scouts report movement of soldiers near the border settlements, he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, an anger Alara understood was directed as much at the situation itself as at her presence within it. They may be testing our defenses, searching for weakness before committing to a larger conflict, or, more troubling still, they may be searching for a more direct method of destabilizing the crown. Meaning, Callan said grimly, understanding his advisor's implication immediately, they may attempt to use Alara herself as a means of forcing my hand. The chamber fell silent at his words, the weight of the threat settling heavily over everyone present. Alara felt her wolf stir anxiously beneath her skin, an instinctive fear response she struggled to suppress as the full implications of the situation became clear. You believe they might try to take her, Edric said quietly. It would be an effective strategy, Lord Hollis admitted reluctantly, his earlier hostility toward Alara momentarily overshadowed by genuine concern for the kingdom's stability. Capture the woman bonded to our king, and you gain significant leverage over his decisions, potentially forcing concessions he would never otherwise consider. Alara felt Callan's hand find hers beneath the table, his grip firm and reassuring despite the tension radiating through his entire body. I will not allow that to happen, he said, his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous certainty that silenced any further debate on the matter. Increasing security around Miss Finch would be prudent, Lady Ashcombe suggested carefully. Additional guards, restricted movement outside the palace walls, perhaps even limiting knowledge of her exact location within the palace itself. See to it immediately, Callan instructed, and the council quickly began organizing the necessary arrangements, a flurry of activity that lasted well into the early morning hours. Once the meeting finally concluded, Callan guided Alara away from the chamber, finding a quiet corridor where they could speak privately, away from the anxious energy still filling the council room. I'm frightened, Alara admitted honestly, once they were alone. Not just for myself, but for you, for the kingdom, for everyone who might be caught in the middle of whatever conflict is brewing because of me. This is not because of you, Callan said firmly, cupping her face gently in his hands. This is because of a rival pack looking for any excuse to press old grievances, using our bond as a convenient justification for actions they likely intended to take regardless. You are not responsible for their ambitions. But if something happens to me because of this bond, Alara pressed, because they see me as a weakness they can exploit. Nothing will happen to you, Callan interrupted, his voice fierce with quiet conviction. I will personally see to your protection, and I will not allow anyone, rival pack or otherwise, to use you against me or against this kingdom. Alara studied his expression carefully, finding steady determination beneath the visible worry etched across his features. I trust you, she said finally softly, but I worry that trust alone will not be enough to keep either of us safe. Over the following days, palace security tightened considerably, additional guards stationed throughout the grounds, Alara's movements carefully monitored and restricted to areas within the palace considered fully secure. The change weighed heavily on her, the constant presence of guards a persistent reminder of the danger surrounding her, yet she understood the necessity even as it chafed against her natural independence. Master Aldrich, sensing her growing anxiety, offered what comfort he could during their shared work in the infirmary. Fear is a natural response to genuine danger, he told her gently, watching her hands tremble slightly while preparing a simple remedy. But do not let it consume you entirely. The king has taken every precaution necessary to keep you safe. Trust in that, even when the fear feels overwhelming. I appreciate your kindness, Master Aldrich, Alara said quietly, but I cannot help feeling that my presence here has brought danger not just to myself, but to everyone within these walls. Nonsense, Aldrich said firmly. The danger existed long before you arrived, my dear. Rival packs have sought excuses to challenge this kingdom's borders for generations. Your bond with the king simply provided a convenient narrative for ambitions that already existed. Do not carry guilt for choices made by people seeking to exploit a situation entirely beyond your control. His words offered some measure of comfort, though the anxiety continued lingering at the edges of Alara's thoughts as the days passed, tension building steadily throughout the palace, as reports from the eastern border grew increasingly concerning. Then, nearly 2 weeks after the initial warning, disaster struck from an entirely unexpected direction. Alara had grown accustomed to her restricted routine, moving carefully between her chambers and the infirmary under careful guard, When she received an urgent message claiming Master Aldrich required her immediate assistance in a rarely used storage room at the edge of the palace grounds, a request delivered by a servant she did not immediately recognize. Trusting the message without proper verification, distracted by weeks of accumulated stress, Elara slipped away from her usual guard escort, following the directions provided toward the isolated storage room. The moment she stepped through the door, she understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. The room was empty, no sign of Master Aldrich anywhere, only dust-covered shelves and the lingering scent of unfamiliar wolves who had clearly passed through recently. Before she could turn to flee, strong hands seized her from behind, a cloth pressed firmly against her face, and the world dissolved into darkness before she could even cry out for help. When Callan discovered less than an hour later that Elara had disappeared from the palace grounds entirely, her guard escort found unconscious near her intended destination, the fury and terror that gripped him surpassed anything he had ever experienced in his entire life. His wolf surged forward violently, overwhelming rational thought entirely, consumed by a singular, desperate need to find her, before harm could befall the woman who had become the truest, most essential part of his existence. Whatever plans the rival pack had set into motion, whatever role Serena's earlier scheming might have played in creating the opportunity for this attack, Callan understood with absolute clarity that he would tear the entire kingdom apart, if necessary, to bring Elara home safely. The bond between them, faint and strained by distance, still pulsed weakly in his chest, a fragile thread he clung to desperately, as he began organizing every resource at his disposal to track her down before it was too late. Elara woke slowly, her head throbbing, the taste of something bitter still lingering at the back of her throat. She found herself in a small, windowless room, stone walls damp with age, a single lantern casting flickering shadows across the floor. Her hands were bound loosely in front of her, not painfully, but firmly enough to prevent any easy escape. She sat up carefully, waiting for the dizziness to pass, and forced herself to think clearly, despite the fear coursing through her veins. Wherever she was, whoever had taken her, panicking would accomplish nothing except wasting precious energy she might need later. The door creaked open, and a man she did not recognize stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the plain, unmarked clothing of someone who wished to remain unidentifiable. He studied her carefully for a long moment before speaking. "You are awake sooner than expected," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent she associated with the Eastern Territories. "Good. That will make things easier." "Who are you?" Elara demanded, keeping her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "What do you want with me?" "My name is not important," the man said. "What matters is that you carry the mark of Alpha King Ashgrove, and that mark makes you considerably valuable to certain parties interested in reshaping the balance of power along the eastern border." "You intend to use me against him," Elara said, understanding settling coldly over her. "Precisely," the man confirmed, offering no attempt to soften the truth. "A king, distracted by concern for his bonded mate, makes careless decisions. Decisions that will benefit my employers considerably during the negotiations already underway. He will never simply hand over territory or concessions because you've taken me," Elara said, though her voice wavered slightly despite her attempt at confidence. The man smiled thinly. "Perhaps not immediately," he said, "but desperation has a way of changing even the most stubborn resolve. We shall see how long his composure lasts once the full weight of your absence settles upon him." He left shortly after, leaving Elara alone once more, with only the flickering lantern and her own racing thoughts for company. She tested the bindings on her wrists carefully, searching for any weakness she might exploit, though the rope held firm despite her efforts. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the occasional sound of muffled voices beyond the door, footsteps passing in the corridor outside. Elara focused on the bond still connecting her to Callan, faint and strained by the distance separating them, yet still present, a steady, reassuring warmth beneath the fear currently consuming her thoughts. She closed her eyes and concentrated on that warmth, willing it to carry some sense of her location, her condition, anything that might help Callan find her more quickly. Back at the palace, Callan had barely slept or eaten since Elara's disappearance, his entire focus consumed by the desperate search for any clue regarding her whereabouts. Edric worked tirelessly alongside him, coordinating search parties throughout the city and surrounding countryside, questioning every servant and guard who might have witnessed anything unusual in the hours before her disappearance. It was during one such interrogation that a troubling piece of information finally surfaced. A young stable hand, nervous and reluctant, admitted under careful questioning that he had witnessed Serena Voss meeting privately with unfamiliar men near the palace's eastern gate several days before Elara's disappearance. men who matched the description of individuals now suspected of orchestrating the kidnapping. Callan received this news with a fury so intense it took every ounce of his considerable self-control to prevent his wolf from surging forward entirely. He summoned Serena immediately, confronting her directly in the privacy of his personal study, Edric standing tensely nearby in case matters escalated beyond civil conversation. "Explain to me," Callan said, his voice deceptively calm despite the barely restrained rage simmering beneath the surface. "Why a stable hand claims to have witnessed you meeting privately with unidentified men near the eastern gate, mere days before Alara's disappearance." Serena's composure cracked visibly, though she attempted to maintain her usual poise. "I don't know what you are suggesting," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I am suggesting," Callan said, stepping closer, his amber eyes blazing with barely contained fury, "that you played some role in arranging Alara's kidnapping, whether directly or through your family's connections along the eastern border. Deny it if you wish, Serena, but understand that I will discover the truth regardless, and if you are found responsible for endangering her life, no amount of noble lineage will protect you from the consequences." Serena's carefully maintained facade finally shattered entirely, tears springing to her eyes as the weight of her actions caught up with her. "I never intended for her to be harmed," she said, her voice breaking. "I only wanted her removed from the palace, sent away quietly so that things could return to how they were meant to be. I contacted my cousin, who has connections along the eastern border, hoping he might simply arrange for her to be relocated somewhere far from here, somewhere she could start a new life without ever needing to return. And instead," Callan said coldly, "your cousin's associates saw an opportunity for something far more dangerous, using her as leverage in a political conflict that has nothing to do with your personal ambitions." Serena's face went pale with horror. "I did not know they intended anything like this," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear to you, Callan, I never wanted her harmed. I only wanted my future back, the future I was promised long before she ever appeared." Callan studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully, searching for any sign of deception. Whatever selfish motivations had driven her initial actions, he sensed genuine horror in her reaction to learning the full consequences of what she had unknowingly set into motion. "You will tell me everything you know about your cousin's connections," Callan said firmly. "Every detail, every name, every location you can recall. If your information helps us find Alara safely, I will consider showing leniency regarding your involvement. If you withhold anything, however, and harm comes to her as a result, I promise you will face the full consequences of your actions, regardless of your family's standing." Serena nodded quickly, tears streaming freely down her face now. "I will tell you everything," she said. "Please, Callan, you must believe me. I never wanted this." Over the following hour, Serena provided every detail she could recall about her cousin's connections along the eastern border, names of associates, likely locations where Alara might be held, information that finally gave Callan's search efforts a genuine direction to pursue. Armed with this new information, Callan assembled a small, highly capable team, including Edric and several of his most trusted guards, preparing to depart immediately for the eastern border regions where Alara was most likely being held. Before departing, he paused briefly in the palace chapel, a place he rarely visited, kneeling silently before the altar in a moment of quiet, desperate prayer. He had never considered himself a particularly devout man, more comfortable with strategy and duty than faith, yet in this moment, facing the very real possibility of losing Alara entirely, he found himself desperately hoping some higher power might guide him safely to her side. "Please," he whispered quietly, "let me find her in time." He rose finally, steadying himself with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through every previous challenge of his reign, and made his way toward the waiting horses, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin, hungry for the chase that lay ahead. Whatever dangers awaited him along the eastern border, whatever forces had conspired to take Alara from him, Callan understood with absolute clarity that nothing would stop him from bringing her home safely, whatever the cost to himself in the process. The bond between them, faint but unbroken, pulsed steadily in his chest as he rode out from the palace gates, a fragile thread of connection guiding him steadily toward the woman who had become, in the span of only a few short weeks, the truest and most essential part of his entire existence. The journey toward the eastern border took the better part of 2 days, Callan pushing his horse and his companions harder than any of them had traveled in recent memory, stopping only when absolutely necessary for rest and fresh mounts. Edric rode close beside him the entire way, occasionally glancing at his friend with quiet concern, recognizing the desperate determination driving him forward. "We will find her," Edric said, during one brief pause to water the horses. Serena's information seemed genuine, The location she described matches reports from our scouts regarding unusual activity near the border settlements. It needs to be enough, Callan said quietly, staring out toward the horizon where the eastern mountains rose faintly against the sky. I cannot lose her, Edric. Not now. Not after everything. You won't, Edric said firmly, though even he could not entirely mask the uncertainty beneath his reassurance. They reached the border settlement described by Serena late on the second day, a small, unremarkable village that showed little obvious sign of housing anything unusual. Callan ordered his men to approach carefully, avoiding direct confrontation until they understood more clearly where Alara might be held within the settlement. Under cover of approaching darkness, Edric slipped into the village alone, using skills honed over years of quiet diplomatic work to gather information without drawing unwanted attention. He returned within the hour, his expression tense but hopeful. There is an old storage building at the edge of the settlement, he reported quietly. Villagers speak of strangers arriving several days ago, keeping largely to themselves, guarding the building carefully. It matches the description Serena provided. Callan felt his wolf surge forward instantly at the news, every instinct screaming at him to charge toward the building immediately. He forced himself to remain calm, recognizing the necessity of careful strategy over reckless emotion. How many guards? He asked. 4 that I could identify, Edric said, possibly more inside. Callan considered their options carefully, weighing the need for speed against the necessity of ensuring Alara's safety throughout whatever confrontation followed. We move at midnight, he decided finally. Quiet approach, minimal confrontation until we locate her precisely within the building. The hours leading up to midnight passed with agonizing slowness, Callan's every instinct urging him toward immediate action, though years of discipline allowed him to maintain the patience necessary for a properly executed plan. When the appointed hour finally arrived, he led his small team quietly through the darkened village toward the storage building Edric had identified. They moved with practiced silence, years of training evident in every careful step, until they reached the shadows surrounding the building itself. Callan signaled his men into position, watching carefully as 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements predictable enough to exploit. Within minutes, his guards had quietly subdued the perimeter patrol, moving swiftly and efficiently to prevent any alarm from being raised. Callan approached the building's entrance himself, Edric close behind him, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Inside, 2 additional guards stood near a heavy wooden door at the far end of a narrow corridor, clearly marking the location where Alara was being held. Callan's wolf surged forward the moment he sensed her presence through the bond, stronger now than it had been in days, close enough that he could almost taste her fear and exhaustion. The confrontation that followed was swift, Callan and his men overwhelming the remaining guards through a combination of surprise and superior training, careful to minimize unnecessary harm while ensuring the path to Alara remained clear. Within minutes, the corridor stood empty of resistance, and Callan reached the heavy wooden door, his hands trembling slightly as he worked quickly to open it. The door swung open to reveal Alara sitting against the far wall, her wrists still bound, her expression shifting rapidly from fear to overwhelming relief as she recognized him standing in the doorway. Callan, she breathed, tears springing instantly to her eyes. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside her and gently working to free her bound wrists, his hands shaking with the force of emotions he had been suppressing for 2 long, agonizing days. I'm here, he said softly, his voice thick with relief. I'm here now. You're safe. Once her hands were free, Alara threw her arms around him, and Callan held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, allowing himself finally to feel the full weight of relief now that she was safely within his arms once more. I knew you would come, Alara whispered against his shoulder. I felt the bond the entire time, faint but present, and somehow I knew you were searching for me. I would have torn apart the entire kingdom if necessary, Callan said, pulling back slightly to study her face carefully, checking for any sign of injury. Are you hurt? Only shaken, Alara assured him. They did not harm me physically. They intended to use me as leverage, nothing more. Callan's expression darkened at her words, though relief remained the dominant emotion coursing through him. We need to move quickly, he said. There may be additional guards nearby, or reinforcements arriving soon. He helped her carefully to her feet, and together with Edric and his remaining guards, they made their way swiftly out of the building and back toward their waiting horses at the edge of the settlement. The journey back toward the palace felt considerably shorter than the desperate ride that had brought them to this remote border village, Alara riding close beside Callan, drawing comfort from his steady presence after the terrifying isolation of her captivity. During a brief pause to rest the horses partway through their return journey, Alara finally found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind since her rescue. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked quietly. Callan hesitated slightly before answering. "Serena provided the information," he admitted. "She was involved, though not intentionally, in the way things unfolded. She arranged for you to be quietly relocated away from the palace, hoping to remove you from my life entirely. She did not anticipate that her cousin's associates would use the opportunity for something far more dangerous." Alara absorbed this information slowly, feeling a complicated mixture of anger and reluctant understanding. "She nearly got me killed," she said finally, out of jealousy and fear for her own future. "Yes," Callan agreed grimly, "and she will face consequences for her actions, make no mistake. But she also provided the information that ultimately allowed us to find you in time, once she understood the full weight of what her scheming had caused." "What will happen to her?" Alara asked. "That," Callan said carefully, "is a decision I intend to make once we return safely to the palace, taking into account both the severity of her actions and the assistance she ultimately provided in locating you." Alara nodded slowly, understanding the complicated nature of justice within the delicate political landscape surrounding them. Whatever punishment awaited Serena, she trusted Callan to weigh the matter fairly, balancing accountability against the genuine remorse she had apparently shown once confronted with the consequences of her actions. As their journey continued back toward the palace, Alara found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since that fateful night at the Masquerade, the accidental bond that had upended her entire life, the challenges and dangers she had faced within the unfamiliar world of palace politics, and the deepening connection she had formed with a man she had once known only as a masked stranger in a moonlit garden. Despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty that had marked so much of her time at the palace, she found herself unable to imagine returning to her old, simple life without him now. Whatever challenges remained ahead, she understood with growing certainty that she wanted to face them alongside Callan, not out of obligation created by an accidental bond, but out of genuine, freely chosen love that had grown steadily stronger through every trial they had faced together. As the palace finally came into view on the horizon, its towers gleaming faintly in the early morning light, Callan reached over and took her hand gently in his own, and Alara felt the warmth of the bond pulse steadily between them, no longer a burden or a fearful uncertainty, but a promise of the life they intended to build together, whatever challenges still lay ahead. News of Alara's safe return spread through the palace within hours, servants and staff alike breathing sighs of genuine relief, many of them having grown fond of her gentle presence during the weeks before her disappearance. Master Aldrich embraced her warmly the moment she returned to the infirmary, tears of relief visible in his aging eyes. "I feared the worst," he admitted, holding her at arm's length to study her carefully for any sign of lasting harm. "I am overjoyed to see you return safely, my dear." "Thank you, Master Aldrich," Alara said, genuinely touched by his obvious concern. "Your kindness these past weeks has meant more to me than you likely realize." The council convened shortly after Callan's return, eager to address both the immediate danger posed by the rival pack's actions and the necessary consequences facing Serena Voss for her role in the events leading to Alara's kidnapping. Callan presided over the meeting with careful authority, weighing every decision thoughtfully despite the emotional weight of recent events. Serena stood before the assembled council, her earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by genuine, humbled remorse. "I understand the severity of what my actions caused," she said quietly, her voice steady despite visible nervousness. "I take full responsibility for the danger my scheming created, regardless of my original intentions. Whatever punishment the council deems appropriate, I will accept it without complaint." Callan studied her carefully before responding. "Your actions nearly cost an innocent woman her life," he said, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable authority. "That cannot be excused or forgotten easily. However, your assistance in ultimately locating her, once you understood the full consequences of your scheming, has been taken into consideration." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the assembled council before continuing. "You will be stripped of your position within the court, and your family's influence over palace matters will be significantly reduced for the foreseeable future. However, in light of your cooperation, you will not face imprisonment or exile, provided you demonstrate genuine reform in the years ahead." Serena bowed her head, accepting the judgment with visible relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "I will not squander this second chance." With the matter of Serena's punishment settled, the council turned its attention to the more pressing concern of the rival pack's aggression along the eastern border. Callan, having witnessed firsthand the lengths to which they were willing to go, authorized immediate reinforcement of border defenses, alongside diplomatic outreach intended to de-escalate tensions before further conflict became necessary. Within weeks, careful negotiations, combined with a clear demonstration of the kingdom's readiness to defend itself, succeeded in convincing the rival pact's leadership to abandon their aggressive posturing, at least for the time being. The immediate danger, while not entirely eliminated, had been sufficiently addressed to allow life within the palace to gradually return to a calmer rhythm. As the weeks passed following her rescue, Elara found herself settling more comfortably into palace life than she had ever anticipated, the earlier hostility from much of the nobility gradually softening, as word spread of her courage throughout the ordeal, and of Callan's fierce determination to bring her home safely. Even those who had initially doubted her place within the palace found themselves reconsidering their judgments, watching the genuine devotion between their king and his once unlikely Omega grow steadily stronger with each passing day. Lord Hollis himself, though never entirely warming to the unconventional nature of the bond, found himself grudgingly respecting Elara's quiet strength and unwavering composure throughout circumstances that would have overwhelmed many far more experienced in matters of court. It was on a warm evening several months after her return, as autumn began settling gently over the kingdom, that Callan called together the entire court for an announcement he had been carefully preparing for weeks. Standing before the assembled nobility in the grand ballroom where their story had first begun, Callan took Elara's hand in his own, addressing the crowd with quiet, unwavering confidence. Many of you have watched these past months with uncertainty, wondering what the bond between myself and Elara Finch truly meant for the future of this kingdom, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I understand the concerns many of you have held, understand the tradition and expectations surrounding a king's choice of mate, but I stand before you today with absolute certainty in my heart. He turned to face Elara directly, his amber eyes warm with genuine affection as he continued. Elara did not choose this bond any more than I did. It was formed through instinct, through fate, through forces neither of us fully understood at the time. But in the months since that night, I have come to understand something far more important than any accident of instinct. I have come to know her heart, her courage, her unwavering kindness even in the face of tremendous adversity. And I have come to love her, not because fate demanded it, but because she has earned that love through every single day we have spent together. A murmur passed through the assembled crowd, though Elara noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that the reaction carried far more warmth than the hostility she had once feared. It is my honor, Callan continued, to announce, before this entire court, my intention to make Elara Finch my queen, not simply as a matter of bond or obligation, but as a matter of genuine, freely chosen love. He turned to Elara, kneeling formally before her in a gesture that drew gasps from the assembled nobility, unaccustomed to seeing their king display such open vulnerability. Elara, he said softly, will you accept this bond, not as something forced upon you by instinct alone, but as a future you choose freely, alongside me? Tears filled Elara's eyes as she looked down at him, remembering the frightened, uncertain woman who had fled through palace gardens on the night of the masquerade, marked by a stranger she had not yet understood. That woman felt impossibly distant now, replaced by someone who had found genuine strength, genuine purpose, and genuine love within these once unfamiliar walls. Yes, she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. I choose this. I choose you, Callan, freely and completely. The ballroom erupted into applause, nobles and staff alike celebrating the announcement with genuine warmth that would have seemed impossible only months before. Even Serena, standing quietly near the edge of the gathered crowd, offered a small, sincere smile, having found within her own humbled circumstances a measure of peace regarding the future she had once fought so desperately to prevent. As the celebration continued around them, Callan rose and pulled Elara gently into his arms, the warmth of their bond pulsing steadily between them, no longer a burden imposed by accident, but a promise freely chosen and deeply cherished. I love you, Callan whispered softly, for her ears alone. I love you too, Elara replied, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, finally home in every sense that truly mattered. Outside the ballroom windows, the same moon that had witnessed their accidental bond months before now shone down upon a celebration built on something far stronger than instinct alone, a love forged through hardship, tested by danger, and ultimately strengthened by the genuine choice both had made to stand together, whatever challenges the future might yet hold. And as the kingdom settled into a new era of peace and stability, the story of the Alpha King who had accidentally marked a healer's assistant at a masquerade became something far more than a simple tale of instinct and fate. It became instead a story the entire kingdom would remember for generations. A story of two people who had turned an unexpected beginning into a love neither of them would ever regret choosing, again and again, for the rest of their lives together.